Thank you all for joining the Lumina Foundation and the Century Foundation today as we discuss this vital topic of increasing racial and socioeconomic diversity in higher education. I'm Jamie Marasotis, President of Lumina Foundation, and I want to welcome you to this event. You know, it was a little over a year ago that we began working together on this volume, The Future of Affirmative Action, which you all have a copy of here. And obviously a lot's happened in the year since we began that makes these issues even more pressing and more timely than ever before. Now, as many of you know, Lumina Foundation is solely focused on higher education. All of our work is aimed towards helping the country achieve this goal 2025, having 60% of Americans hold a high-quality post-secondary degree, certificate, or other credential by the year 2025. So why is diversity important to us? And perhaps more pressingly for our purposes at Lumina Foundation, why is equity so important to us? The simple answer, of course, is that we know that our nation, our democracy, our society depend on a talented populace. Our fellow Americans, all of our fellow Americans, must be equipped to handle the demands and rigors of a 21st century economy and a democracy. We cannot build a path forward without ensuring that our post-secondary systems are focused on both the core values of equity and excellence. Now, you all know that census data show that 49% of working-age whites, those between the ages of 25 and 64, hold at least a two-year degree. For African Americans in that age group, the rate is just 32%. Among Native Americans, it's 29%, and among Hispanics, just 22%. These attainment gaps are a huge societal problem, and increasing racial diversity is a crucial step in addressing that problem. But it's just one step, and what I'd like to do is take a moment to talk about how we might want to think about both diversity and equity, because really they are not synonymous. We view equity as the recognition and the analysis of historic and persistent factors that have created an unequal post-secondary education system. This discussion right here, right now, is a prime example. Through this Ideas Summit and the publication of the book, I think both the Lumina Foundation and the Century Foundation are suggesting that it's important to not only recognize historical racial inequity, but more importantly, to focus on what to actually do about it. Collectively, we've been fighting for decades to expand access to post-secondary education, and while that's incredibly important because we have not solved the access challenge in the United States by any means, it simply isn't enough. What happens to these students once they enter the doors of our post-secondary institutions? Now, diversity is a necessary step towards achieving equity, but it's not enough in and of itself. Diversity, I think, really reflects things like acceptance and respect, surely important, but as I said, not enough. So diversity, the main topic of today's summit, is really a stepping stone to a more equitable and excellent system. That equitable and excellent system of higher education is one that's student-centered. In other words, it's committed to access and success and provides the support that all students need to succeed. It's flexible. It values the different pathways students take to acquire the knowledge, skills, and abilities they need to succeed in life. And it's affordable. In other words, the cost of college is more predictable, more transparent, and is within the reach of families of all backgrounds. Now, today's conversation focuses on recent affirmative action cases and promoting diversity at selective institutions, but I challenge us to look beyond the Fisher and Schuette decisions and create a new standard of educational achievement for all higher education institutions. That new standard is one where we recognize the structural, the historic, and the persistent factors that have created unequal educational opportunities and economic outcomes. It's one where we create opportunities rather than construct barriers. And it's one where student success is at the center of the paradigm for post-secondary learning. Today, In our work as the Lumina Foundation and the Century Foundation, we simply cannot conduct business as usual. The higher education system is critical to our economic and our social future in America, but the higher education system is not meeting our nation's needs, and it has neglected far too many people for far too long. That not only affects those individuals and groups, it impacts all of us as Americans and indeed our collective well-being as a nation. So thank you all very much for being here and engaging in this incredibly important dialogue. And now I'm pleased to introduce our partners in this effort, the Century Foundation, and I'd like to ask Greg Anrig, Century's Vice President for Policy and Programs, to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jamie. It really has been a pleasure for those of us at the Century Foundation to work with the people from the Lumina Foundation, and we couldn't be happier with the final product. We really think this is an important document that will significantly influence the debate, and even today it was talked about in the New York Times by David Leonhardt. So I think we all should feel good about what we've accomplished here. The Century Foundation was actually founded in 1919 by Edward Farlene, who's probably even better known for founding Farlene's Basement up in Boston, the clothing retailer. He was actually one of the original progressives. He was a Republican businessman who believed that government could produce policies that would enable the broader society to improve, and that average people's economic well-being could do better over time if careful research was applied to how government implemented its policies. And that basic belief system has animated us institutionally for the 95 years that we've been around. And obviously education has been central to that line of work of promoting economic inequality. And for the past 15 of those 95 years, Richard Kallenberg has been leading our efforts on the education front. Rick is a senior fellow with us. Throughout all the work that he's done, whether it's with respect to K through 12 or higher education, his whole orientation has been how do we create more opportunities for students from low-income families to get the same chances that those in middle and upper-income families get when it comes to education. And this product today, again, very much reflects that mindset. I should mention another project that we came through and released about a year ago that Rick led, focused on the issue of community colleges. And it was a task force of leading experts on the topic from around the country, co-chaired by Anthony Marks, the head of the New York Public Library, and previously the head of Amherst College, and Eduardo Pedron, who was the head of the Miami-Dade Community College. And that report really focused on what our concerns that the community college system is becoming overly stratified and separate from the rest of the higher educational system. In essence, what's becoming a separate but unequal approach to higher education. And so calling attention to that concern and then talking about how do we more closely integrate the pieces of the higher educational system to create greater connections so that people can not feel like they're going to be isolated in a system that's not going to be as strong as the other. So we're thrilled about that. And then today's topic really focuses on the selective colleges and what can be done in the context of the recent Supreme Court decisions to enable them to not only sustain racial diversity, but also increase economic diversity, to create more opportunities for low-income students to have a chance to go to top-notch selective colleges, because that, after all, is where the leadership class of the United States comes from. So we are very excited to have as a keynote speaker today Nancy Cantor. And Nancy is the Chancellor of Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey. Previously, she had been Chancellor at Syracuse, and she has actually served on the Community College Task Force that I mentioned earlier. And I'm going to read a short excerpt of a piece she wrote for the Huffington Post because it really captures why we thought she should be our lead speaker today. She wrote, 30 years ago, a National Commission on Excellence in Education told us we were a nation at risk because of the failures of our education system. Today, we are a nation in peril if we continue to leave so much talent behind and fail to leverage the creativity of the diverse next generation to spur innovation. If we try to be as selective as possible to promote quality and still ensure comparative fairness of educational opportunity, we doom our judgments to be based on dangerously narrow grounds, those that can most easily be ranked and compared, and we doom our institutions to reach a smaller and increasingly less relevant swath of America. When the basis for comparison of quality is 50 or even 100 points of difference in a segment of the SAT score continuum, already well above the national average, a difference that is hard to argue has or can differentiate our high-achieving alums across occupations from the average of our graduates, one has to wonder if we've lost our way in the weeds of selectivity and comparative fairness. And as we perfect this fundamentally reductionist tack, we not only leave behind more and more of our talent pool, our potential game changers in business, politics, and even law, but we also relinquish some of our power as educators, cultivators of talent, and community or nation builders. So, ladies and gentlemen, Nancy Cantor.
Thank you very much, and thanks to both Jamie and Rick and others for organizing this and the volume that went with it. Okay. So, let me start with something we've all said already this morning, and that is that the stakes for earning a post-secondary degree are extremely high for individuals and for the nation as a whole. We simply can't afford to leave the nation's diverse talent pool behind. So one way to image it is to think about an hourglass flipped. The kids are falling through. The sands are falling through. We're running out of time. When we think about the minority kids that are being born now as majority in this state, in this United States, when we think about losing that talent pool, when we think about the U.S. falling below Great Britain in indices in the OECD nations of social mobility through education, when we think, as Sean Reardon said, the great divide, no rich kid left behind, we cannot have a prosperous nation. Higher education is the key to economic competitiveness, both for individuals and for the nation. So we have to do something about it. But when we think about doing something about it, it is critical, I would argue, and many people have, that we not get caught in a bind of thinking of us as either colorblind or post-racial. Race and class matter. They matter individually, independently, and they matter together. And they set the landscape in critical, positive, and negative ways. And we need to think of both of that. So first of all, we know, as Sherilyn Eiffel said, that we are incredibly constrained by stereotypes that operate every day, day in and day out. All blacks are poor, all whites are rich, and all Latinos speak Spanish, right? No, Tony's shaking his head. Okay. If we are going to bust out of the confines of those stereotypes, we need to understand how to marshal the talent pool that's falling through that hourglass. We need to understand how to marshal the power of diversity in group problem solving and innovation, in creating metropolitan America as a vibrant, living economy and place. We need to learn how to dialogue across difference. And if we are going to do that, we have to acknowledge structural disparities, the inequity that Jamie talked about. We have to acknowledge the way in which reductionist stereotypes doom us, and we have to acknowledge that there's work to do on the ground to learn how to dialogue across difference. If higher education is going to play a part, and I think that's what today is about, I would challenge us, and this wonderful volume put together gives lots of examples, and we'll hear about them today. I would challenge us not to lose talent to the dating game. We have become pawns to the dating game in selective admissions. It is not that we shouldn't be on a talent search. We should be on a talent search for the attributes that produce the future leaders who will change this country. The grit, the resilience, what Posse has been doing for some time, and we'll hear from Derron on that. We should be looking beyond the narrow confines, and we should not be deluding ourselves. And here I'll quote Justice Ginsburg in her Fisher opinion. She says, "I've said before and reiterate here that only an ostrich could regard the supposedly neutral alternatives as race unconscious." I'm not here to give an argument about the legal structure of the arguments that need to be made. But I am here to say that no matter what we do in order to create a diverse student body in all of the institutions across the spectrum of higher education, we should never forget the landscape out there in which talent is embedded and from which it comes. And we should most specifically not forget our task is to find the talent, not to create more and more intricate proxies to hide that talent behind the screen of the dating game. We need to include, not exclude. We need to reach. We need to cultivate. We need to do what educators are supposed to be doing. So how do we reach and cultivate and share talent? That, to me, is the task that Lumina and Century are putting before us. How do we reach, how do we cultivate, and how do we share talent to create opportunity not only for individuals, but more importantly, in some sense, for the places from which they come and the spaces that constitute our democracy. So first of all, we've got to reach. We all know that there are already exceptional high-achieving students, even when mapped on the basis of narrow indicators of quality, out there in metropolitan America, in rural America, ready to be reached. It is higher education's task to reach them. This happens to be a book cover from the Hamilton Project that ACT and SAT and Hoxby and Turner are doing. But there are many ways of reaching. We have to be reaching. We have to be reaching in a way that creates what I would argue are farm teams. So you may wonder why I have Major League Baseball up there. It's not just because my Yankees are losing. It's because we need to mimic the farm team approach. When you think about what Major League Baseball does, I grew up in New York City, but I spent many years in Ann Arbor, and we would take our kids to the Toledo Mud Hens. And what was so striking about the Toledo Mud Hens was that farm team not only cultivated talent, but it created community, economic development, community, a vibrant place in need of that kind of commitment. And then the talent that came from the farm team was shared all across Major League Baseball. We need to be doing exactly the same thing. I have up here the Say Yes to Education, Higher Education Compact that we at Syracuse were involved with, and Buffalo is involved with, and many other places. The notion here is that not only do you go in and create a farm team, in this case those are Syracuse kids in the Syracuse City School District, and you create wraparound services and interventions and student monitoring and legal work for families and health clinics, but you get some of the best institutions in the country, from Harvard to Duke to whatever, to pledge tuition scholarships for those kids who graduate from the City of Syracuse School District and qualify for admissions. So you are building a farm team. You are changing the face of an older industrial city. You are recruiting its talent and sharing that talent widely. And of course, what Jamie and the Lumina Foundation have been doing is exactly that, in creating educational pathways that look at adult learners, that look at those with some credentials but not full credentials, that look at the full pathway from K to 20, and try metro after metro to increase the talent pool going on. Higher education has to play its role. I want to point critically to the importance of community colleges in this reaching, cultivating, and sharing talent in creating these farm teams. We cannot create farm teams without investing in our community colleges and connecting our four-year institutions to those community colleges. The vast majority of the fastest growing population of college-going students in this country will have their first taste of higher education at a community college. And the Bridging Higher Education Divide report that the Century Foundation produced is critical to arguing that we need to create that full pathway. So when we do all this, and there's a lot of work to do, it will be back to the past to get to the future. We will create the barn raising that Lincoln and Justin Morrill meant when they created the Great Land Grant Acts. They were arguing that innovation and opportunity were completely intertwined. That when you created and shared innovation in the agrarian economy and simultaneously educated the sons and daughters of those farm communities, when you paid attention to the community and brought the sons and daughters to the institutions, you would create the kind of vibrancy that a democracy depends upon. That's what we have to do. And really, I think what we're talking about today asks the question whether the Morrill Act is still in our national DNA. Can we really reach out and cultivate in the places that matter in this country to its future the talent that matters in those places? That's the question. The question is not whether we do it through one factor or another. The question is whether we get the ostrich's head out of the sand and into our communities to get the talent that we know will build this country and rebuild it and rebuild its democracy. And now I turn to Derron, who is the future of this country. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Nancy, for that warm and generous introduction. Your consistent leadership on issues of diversity and inclusion continue to inspire much admiration. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to speak with you all this morning and to talk, or reiterate rather, from my point of view, the importance of racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity for the future of higher education in the United States. To complement Nancy's remarks, I wish to highlight or shed light on, rather, one innovative strategy or necessary approach for finding top talent for colleges and universities in oft overlooked places, and with such talent, building multicultural cross-racial alliances trained to improve the quality of leadership in our society. Now, narratives about the independent, hard-working high achiever who by her own or his own drive and determination attains success despite the odds have considerable traction in American society. Let me try that again. Narratives about the independent, hard-working high achiever who by her or his own drive and determination attains success despite the odds have considerable traction in American society. Perhaps it's because it reinforces popular beliefs in the power of rugged individualism and the easy accessibility of the American dream. However, my journey from high school in the Bronx to college just outside of Boston and then to graduate school in Britain does not align itself perfectly with such tidy narratives. Instead, my story is about the growth of the individual as part of the collective, about the development of the person as part of the posse. My introduction to higher education came through posse, and for those of you who don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with the 1980s term, but posse is now a premier college access and leadership development program in this country, with offices in major cities such as New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and even here in D.C. The Posse Foundation selects talented leaders from public high schools and sends them in teams of 10, in posses, to selective colleges and universities like Brandeis, Middlebury, Pomona, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Wheaton, among many others. Since 1989, Posse has recruited and trained thousands of students who serve as leaders on campus and ultimately in the workforce. The moment I learned about my selection for Posse was certainly one of the happiest days of my life. I recall with fondness that chilly December afternoon I zigzagged through the swarm of students flooding the corridors of my large public high school in New York City, what was then and still is now one of the largest high schools in New York City. I wanted to find out from my college advisor whether or not I had been selected for the award. Now, consider the anxiety I felt when he told me that he heard about someone else's case and not my own. And that he'd informed me that indeed that peer of mine had been selected for the award. My heart races at the very thought of that moment. It was not until later that afternoon that I found out that I, along with 9 other young leaders from across New York City, had been awarded a full tuition scholarship to Wheaton College in Massachusetts. That experience proved both moving and magical for me, for in but a moment, Posse changed the possibilities of my life. It changed the course of my trajectory for good. It took a young man who was the fifth child for his parents and sent him away to a school and made him the first in his immediate and extended family to go to college. Rather than attending a local or state school as I'd planned, Posse introduced me to a selective college that I had not heard of in a state I'd never been to. And it did more than that. Posse provided me with the network of leaders needed to thrive at Wheaton. My posse was the fullest representation of diversity I knew as a high school senior. We came from all walks of life and from a variety of racial, ethnic, and social class backgrounds. We were Black, white, Latino, and Asian. We were poor, working class, and middle class. We were Christian, Hindu, Muslim, and agnostics. We were African American, Jewish, Chinese, Indo-Caribbean, Dominican Americans, It was the most close-knit, challenging, and diverse team I'd ever been a part of in my life. As a result, the singular lens through which I view the world cracked, and over time was replaced by more complex ones. My worldviews were complicated by those in my posse and theirs by mine. This, for me, was a truly higher education, one that had a direct impact on the complexity of my ideas and the value of the college's learning climate. Now, Nancy and a number of higher education leaders argue for the importance of an architecture of inclusion. Posse, to my mind, is just that and so much more. It afforded me a purposeful pathway to personal, academic, and professional success. One I think thousands of young people across the United States need if we are to build a more just society that promotes social mobility for all. I could go on and on talking about my posse. I could talk about how we graduated and became teachers and business leaders, how we founded education programs and did a host of things in our society. However, I'm deeply concerned about the thousands of untapped talent in metropolitan cities and rural communities, those who do finish high school, but due to social woes and economic barriers, real and imagined, do not attend college or do not attend the very best colleges they possibly can. We have heard time and time again the economic benefits of developing diverse talent. I found, however, that in recent months, the cost of developing such talent or not developing such talent can be even more costly than doing so. Let me explain. I've recently returned to the community that I lived in before I went to college. And every so often, going to a convenience store, going to a gas station, I bump into my pre-posse posse, my circle of friends that I went to high school with. And invariably, they're the ones working in the convenience store, many of whom were, to my mind, more gifted than I was and should have attended a top college just as I did. I'm concerned about this talent, and I know you are too. In a political context, and I close, in a political context in which ballot initiatives and Supreme Court cases restrict the extent to which race can be considered in college admission, we need creative approaches like Posse that deploy diversity in all its forms as a public good and a code word for excellence. We need to consider race, place, and class Even amidst current political constraints, the diversity imperative demands acknowledgement and action for colleges and universities all across the country. The future of our country and the lives of talented youth across our country depend on it. If you remember anything else today, please note that our political pronouncements must be backed by action. And that's what we're all here to figure out. Thank you ever so much.
So we're going to start our first panel now. So if I could invite those of you on the legal panel to come up, I'd appreciate it. Thanks. Great. Well, my name is Richard Collenberg. I'm a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and I want to thank Nancy and Derron for those incredibly inspiring remarks to get us started. The stakes are enormous in making sure that our universities and colleges are diverse by race, by class, and I think the two of you hit just the right tone to get us started. So the panel that we have today to start us off is perhaps less lofty in its ambitions. We're going to talk about the constraints that the Supreme Court has imposed on using race in admissions to selective colleges. In the cases of Fisher versus University of Texas and Schuette versus Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action. So in the Fisher litigation, as many of you know, Abigail Fisher, a white student, sued the University of Texas at Austin, and she argued that the consideration of race was unconstitutional because UT Austin had created an alternative plan known as the Top 10% Plan, by which students in the top 10% of every high school were automatically admitted, that was creating enough diversity on its own, so the continued use of race was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, by 7-1 last year, decided to kick the case back to the Fifth Circuit for further deliberations, but in doing so, they laid out an important, or reaffirmed an important principle, which is that universities may only use race when necessary to promote a compelling state interest. And the key passage in the Fisher decision stated that strict scrutiny imposes on the university the ultimate burden of demonstrating before turning to racial classifications that available, workable, race-neutral alternatives do not suffice. And also, for the first time, the court held that the university receives no deference on questions of whether race-neutral alternatives suffice. So our panel today is going to analyze the Fisher decision and discuss what this means for universities. So what is sufficient diversity? What makes an alternative workable or not workable? For example, the UNC, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, as a plan, they said that they could create as much racial diversity using a top 10% plan, but that would involve a decline in median SAT scores by 50 points. So does that make a plan unworkable? Overall, what should universities be doing in light of Fisher? And perhaps most importantly, can the Fisher decision be seen as an opportunity for universities to expand their thinking on diversity to include socioeconomic status along with race? So we're fortunate to have three really superb panelists to discuss these issues. The first is Catherine Lhamon, who is the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education for Civil Rights. We're really pleased and honored, Catherine, that you're able to be here to take time out of your busy schedule to discuss these issues with us. Next up will be Arthur Coleman, who is the managing partner at Education Counsel, who has a chapter in our new book, The Future of Affirmative Action. And then finally, we'll hear from Scott Greytak, who is a higher education attorney and also has a chapter in the book. Scott gained some attention last year for correctly predicting the outcome in the Fisher case and the remand. So each will be given 7 minutes to speak. And Mercedes Gonzalez is here and is going to keep time. And I've asked her to let the participants know how much time they have left after, if things start to get out of hand, she will stand. And so that will be a signal to all of us to stop. And she's about to do that to me, so I better move on. So, Catherine, can you start us off, please?
Thank you. Thanks so much. And I see so many friends in this audience, too, so I think I'll try not to take the full 7 minutes so that we can actually have a conversation at the end of the panel as well. But I'm just thrilled to be with all of you. I think this is among the most important topics that we could be talking about in the country. And, my main message is that we have reiterated over and over again what the Supreme Court has reiterated over and over again, that diversity is critically important to the educational enterprise, and both the Department of Education and the Department of Justice and this administration actively support achieving diversity in our colleges and universities. And so I think it's really important for us to be having the conversation about how to go about doing that, and want to make sure that the main message is that that's still permissible, it's still an important goal, and we want to work arm in arm with you to find ways to achieve that goal. One of the key ways that we are trying to do our part in that effort is to put out guidance, which we've done repeatedly, including in the last year. So when the Supreme Court issued the Schuette decision just this spring, we put out immediate guidance that followed it to make sure that the education community knows that that decision did not change the existing 40 years of precedent about the ability to achieve diversity in schools through lawful means. And then we had a Q&A document that we put out last fall that also makes that same point clear and answers some follow-up questions from the 2011 guidance that we had put out about the use of race in colleges and universities admissions. And then we also had some 1994 guidance, which, though dated, still is operational. And I know Art, when he was with us in our office, had a strong hand in the preparation of that guidance. So thank you for it. And that is also still operational. So want to make sure that you all know that we have written guidance that's available. It's on our website. We'd love for you to take a look at it and use it. We also are willing to and delighted to offer technical assistance to colleges and universities that are trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. In practical terms, nothing has changed for us in our analysis. We never deferred to colleges and universities in the consideration. We always independently reviewed what colleges and universities were doing to determine whether their decisions were legally appropriate. And so, the Fisher guidance lets us all know that deference is not appropriate on that topic, and that it's important to consider whether workable race-neutral alternatives exist if the college or university attempts to pursue a compelling interest in achieving diversity. And that question is something that is stated in the present tense in the court's doctrine. So it's something that we really encourage colleges and universities not to do one time, but to do on a continuous basis over and over as the safest means. So where we have reviewed colleges and universities' decisions and have approved them, the strongest and safest way to do it is to regularly review whether there is some other process that can work, and if not, then to proceed with caution. But the kinds of workable race-neutral alternatives that the court has suggested that colleges and universities should use do not mean you have to break your bank, do not mean that you have to take extraordinary measures, but they do mean that you need to emphasize what is workable. And that's often an educational decision, and it's often specific to the particular institution, but the kinds of things that very many institutions have considered and we have approved, and courts also have approved, include taking a look at whether socioeconomic diversity could achieve race diversity at the school, taking a look at whether less reliance on, for example, legacies in admissions could achieve greater diversity in schools, taking a look at whether increasing financial aid at an institution could achieve greater diversity in schools. Those are the kinds of things that can work. In addition, outreach to particular high schools and colleges, strong relationships with the community to encourage kids to think about going to college, and in particular to going to your college, is a tool that can work very well, that can satisfy the effort to achieve race-neutral means. So there are a number of alternatives that are in operation that can work and may work at particular institutions where, for some reason, an institution knows that it won't work, either because the institution has tried and it didn't achieve the success, or because the institution has some means to determine that it's not a workable race-neutral alternative, for example, because increasing financial aid isn't financially possible for the institution. Then that's the point at which the institution can make decisions about whether individualized use of race needs to be a part of the admissions practice. Even in that instance, of course, just as a reminder that the decision should be holistic. I see I've got my 2 minutes, and I said I was going to stop early, so I'm going to stop here. The decision should be holistic, and the use of race cannot be the determinative factor. So that's my last warning. Happy to take questions and looking forward to further conversation.
Great. Thank you. Art?
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to Lumina and Century for facilitating this collaborative effort. I think we've all learned a lot in the process and have a healthy appreciation for some new perspectives along the way. I do want to begin first by acknowledging my co-author, Terry Taylor, who's here, and frankly, a number of colleagues who are in the room who have been instrumental through their efforts in shaping and informing the thinking that went into this. We've been part of the College Board's Access and Diversity Collaborative, working with institutions around the country for over a decade. ACE, AAC, and you, and others have been instrumental, frankly, in shaping and informing the thinking so that we can hopefully give the best sort of post-decision guidance, and in this case, Fisher. So I want to talk about, I was given sort of a task, talk about what's not changed, talk about what potentially has changed, and then I want to add some key points that I think we should be focused on fairly clearly. Let me start with a simple notion that it's as shocking as this is coming from this panel. It's not all about the lawyers. That stepping back even from the details of the question of race-conscious practices and diversity, the importance of having clear goals and objectives, which is a thematic you hear and you see, and clear rationales behind those goals and objectives that you see surface in court opinions and in OCR decisions on issues like this. And that the key starting points and foundations are stakeholder engagement in a higher ed setting. Obviously, faculty engagement among many other sets of stakeholders is critically important, and you see that surface in some of the cases. The notion of educational soundness really drives the process of analysis, both what makes sense as a matter of research and experience, and what process do you pursue to ensure that you are staying in tune with and aligned with those key principles. And yes, ultimately then what's lawful, but that question of what's lawful is very much driven by the question of educational soundness. So I start from the proposition that we should see these things as corresponding and fundamentally aligned, even if we might not always like the particular question a particular justice may pose, that the fundamentals are there. And then to carry it to the diversity context, I want to echo one point that Jamie made earlier this morning that I think is so important in this setting. The diversity rationale a la Fisher, post-Bacote, post-Grutter, post-Gratz is a limited strategy. It is not the be-all and end-all. It is not the question of access writ large. It is not the question of opportunity writ large. Are there synergies? Yes. Are there fundamental points of alignment? Yes. But it is not in, I think, properly understood, the entire scenario around which we're talking about the kind of issues that Nancy so articulately identified. I think in this context, what you need to understand is this paradigm, post-Bacote, post-Grutter, post-Fisher, has not changed. It is a question of what the right combination of enrollment management and other strategies are that lead to critical mass in the court's jurisprudence based on social science research, that generate improved teaching and learning, preparation for the workforce, and enhanced civic values whatever those institution-specific goals, those school-specific goals, sometimes those department-specific goals actually are. And so I think while we tend to obsess over numbers, numbers are an important, a necessary but not sufficient foundation here. One of the things the courts typically don't spend a lot of time on is talking about the importance of what do you do with a student once they've been enrolled. And so that's a key question moving forward. So in a slightly murkier vein, how many lawyers in the room, if you're willing to admit it? Wow, that's a lot of lawyers willing to admit it. For the non-lawyers in the room, here's your JD 101 in one slide. Give a guy credit. So this is the standard the courts pursue. You hear it referred to as strict scrutiny, and the question is sort of post-Fisher, what has changed with respect to that standard? And what I want to suggest, very much along the lines that Catherine stated, is nothing fundamentally has changed there. The basics of the paradigm have shifted, but there is an element of tone and there is an element of what kind of evidence that I think surfaced in Justice Kennedy's opinion that raises some fundamental questions moving forward. We've got the elements you see here with respect to each, and the question of ends. We're talking about the educational benefits of diversity and the cases that sort of support that as a compelling interest. And then you've got holistic, individualized review captured. That was where Grutter and Gratz really focused. A K through 12 case surfaced the issue of what impact are you having with these race-conscious measures, and then there's Fisher. And Fisher is fundamentally about the question of how you demonstrate the necessity of those race-conscious measures. But what I want to suggest is beyond that question, which slightly reframed Justice O'Connor's articulation from Grutter, there is a sense of a lens of rigor that may be more pronounced by this court than it was a decade ago. And so those are important points to acknowledge. Very quickly, what to keep your eyes on. Is it race conscious or is it race neutral? We tend to assume we know what we're talking about here, and what I want to suggest is the line is murky. It is not definitively settled. We saw the ostrich with the head in the sand quote. Key questions here, and we shouldn't assume that everything that has a race awareness or race consciousness, even in non-legal terms, is necessarily something that would trigger strict scrutiny. It depends on the design. And so you've got multiple avenues to think through what programs and practices are and aren't. And then finally, the question the court did not address at all. It punted, showing its brilliance. What is critical mass? What is this measure by which we gauge success over time? We know it can't be quotas. We know it can't be amorphous. The question is, what is it and how does it look? What does it look like? Highly contextualized, highly tailored, as Texas would argue, to its particular circumstance, different than the University of Michigan's law school a decade ago. It is more than numbers. It's about the context. I think it's fundamentally a question of a contextual benchmark to guide decision making. So I will leave it with that and pass it to you, Scott.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you, Art, for laying the foundation on that as well. My presentation, I'm going to go a little bit more into detail on the context that surrounded the Fisher decision, which I think is incredibly valuable in drawing some strong conclusions and some policy recommendations when we look at the decision. In short, I differ, I would say, substantially, but not as far as I imagined initially. In my interpretation of the case, I think that Fisher did introduce a new legal standard that has changed the paradigm to a substantial level from what we were dealing with previously in Grutter. And I present that for 4 specific reasons. The author of the Fisher decision, I believe that passed his prologue where Justice Anthony Kennedy stood on positions of K-12 integration, on affirmative action, are highly informative on the Fisher decision here, and that a lot of his previous language makes its way, is echoed into Fisher in ways that we can detect and trace back to his first 2 decisions on affirmative action in the K-12 and higher education context. Second, I think I can speak pretty confidently for the legal community that we expected affirmative action when going before the Roberts Court, a court that has given us decisions on gun rights like Heller and gutting the Voting Rights Act, Schuette, which we can talk about as well, that we expected it wasn't going to be necessarily a positive outcome when Fisher was heard. Perhaps most importantly is the text, the language of Fisher. differs. It has different operative language. It has different words that I think we should give meaning, which I think construct a different standard going forward. And then finally, maybe just to the naked eye, 4 justices have switched their orientation between the Grutter decision and the Fisher decision. And I think this as well has meaning that we need to be able to unpack. So to be quick on this, a lot of text. The author of our Fisher decision has never voted to uphold any affirmative action policy over his over 25 years on the court. He's 0 for 4. He made it very clear in the Grutter decision that he strongly prefers race-neutral programs, and he was disappointed that the Grutter standard didn't incentivize and in some ways encourage universities to pursue race-neutral alternatives before turning to racial classifications. About 4 years later, in the K-12 context, but also along the same vein of thinking, Justice Kennedy said that if school districts wanted to use racial classifications, that they would have to show, operative language here at the bottom, that they're a last resort. You can only use race-conscious classifications if they are, there's no other way to accomplish your goals. So this was the stage that we saw set up prior to the Fisher decision. I started working on this opinion when it was, or working on the case when it was first accepted. And I had an article come out last summer that used this context to provide a set of recommendations. And I thought it was going to be much more dire. I thought, again, the Roberts Court deciding to hear affirmative action in lieu of the colorblindness jurisprudence, cases like Ritchie, and that we've seen bore out. I thought it was going to be a much more negative outcome. So an article that I put together said that looking at Justice Kennedy's dissent in Grutter, his controlling opinion in Parents Involved, these cases and the holdings that come from them, when you look at the dissent in Grutter, the majority opinion in Grutter, and then Kennedy's controlling opinion in Parents Involved, they put, and my quote is, they're just seemingly incompatible standards. Something had to give. And certainly enough, I think something did give in the Fisher decision. I think that there are 2 points of focus about what this decision means. First is what I call mission deference. Mission deference means the level of scrutiny that a court will put on a university on their decision to pursue diversity in the first place. So the standard in Grutter in 2003 is that the court typically gives deference in this capacity. That was changed, albeit slightly, some new wording, but what I point out here is that it is new language. Whether it has much of an effect, personally I don't think that it does, but Justice Kennedy did make a point to say that it's an academic judgment to which some but not complete deference is proper. Instead, it must be accompanied by a reasoned and principled explanation. That is very new language, didn't appear in Grutter. And I think that just gives a preview of the more important part of this decision, which is when it comes to admission deference, and that is when a university goes to effectuate diversity, how they go about accomplishing that, what policies they use, and what standard of scrutiny the court should use in reviewing those policies. So in Grutter, the court essentially took the law school at its word that no race-neutral alternatives existed. There was not a very high threshold for evidence when it came to race neutrals. In Fisher, Justice Kennedy made it clear that the university receives no deference on whether race-neutral strategies will suffice. Now, in Grutter, the upper limit of what's required, Sandra Day O'Connor authoring the opinion saying, narrow tailoring the standard does not mean that a university has to exhaust every conceivable race-neutral before turning to an affirmative action policy. And this is maintained in Fisher. Thank you. This is maintained in Fisher, sort of an upper bound. This is essentially what Justice Kennedy said in the Parents Involved decision, but that was in the K-12 context. So he's not extending that here. So what is the standard? In Grutter, the standard finally became that a university had to give serious good faith consideration of race-neutral alternatives before turning to programs that are race-conscious. Now, that's gone from an act to consider to the charge to demonstrate before turning to such racial classifications that available race-neutral alternatives don't get the job done. So in Grutter, there was a charge to the universities to consider race-neutral alternatives. Now I believe that that charge has evolved into you have to demonstrate, to show, to provide evidence that these race neutrals do not get the job done before you turn to race-conscious policies. Finally, 4 justices have switched sides I mentioned. Just you can take a look. This is what the court looked like in Grutter. Thank you. And then 10 years later, we have 4 justices, 80% of the justices that were on both the Grutter court and on the Fisher court. You can see the change. And I think that this change has substance to it. I think there was probably some sort of compromise opinion involved here, but you can see that the overwhelming majority of the justices have changed their orientation in regard to the standard. I think that needs to have some meaning attached to it. So moving through some of the responses to the decision, I think the most important one that I've seen is from Judge Higginbottom from the Fifth Circuit. That's the court that's reviewing Fisher right now, and this is during the oral argument last November. He asks the litigants, sort of ponders out loud, what's the unfairness of letting the University of Texas go forward under the Fisher standard? We, obviously, the district court and now his court, were seriously mistaken in not following the dissent in Grutter, authored by Justice Kennedy, because we did not anticipate that it would become the rule in Fisher. And so I think that best evidences the transition that's taken place between these two cases. Finally, and we can touch on this during the Q&A, just some recommendations that I put out in the chapter. Again, I think it's been a significant shift. Fisher has made it easier for opponents of race-conscious admissions policies to succeed in court because it's changed the burden of proof. I think it provides momentum for additional lawsuits against universities, and we've seen that popping up in at least 3 states. I think that universities are best prepared when they adapt to this new legal landscape. They serve their clientele best when they're the most informed. So altogether, I advise universities to review and, if necessary, redesign their mission goals, their sufficient diversity, their critical mass goals, to explore all available workable plans, including race-conscious admissions plans, in order to achieve sufficient diversity, and then finally to ultimately redesign or reaffirm an admissions plan, whichever is necessary. Thanks.
Good. Well, I want to congratulate you all for avoiding Mercedes' wrath. I'm going to ask one quick question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. We will hear later about Tony Carnevale's research, which was featured in the New York Times this morning, suggesting that if you use socioeconomic status at the most selective colleges, that you could achieve roughly the same amount of racial diversity. But Catherine, I thought you brought up a great point, which is that universities shouldn't be required to break the bank. And so I wanted the 3 of you to dig into that a little bit. If a university could achieve as much racial diversity using socioeconomic status, but it would have to shift a lot of its money from merit aid to need-based aid in order to do that, do you think that the courts would require that step of universities, or would they say, no, we're not going to push you that far, that the fact that you'd have to shift money from merit aid to need-based aid would make the program, the alternative, unworkable?
So it's hard to speak for courts. I can speak for what we would do in OCR. So when we are doing our own investigations, I start from personal preference for need-based aid in the first place. So while I'm here, I certainly view that as a plus. The questions would really be: does the university want to try to achieve diversity in the first place? And so having crossed that threshold so that the effort is there, if the university were to try to say, we don't have a way to do that without using race, as against the question whether the university could in fact do that, if it were to change its extant pot of financial aid from merit to need, it'd be hard to say that it absolutely cannot be done without doing that. It's I think a different question if the university is considering whether it has to increase the amount of financial aid to be given, because that's a cost question that's has pretty serious consequences for other educational decisions at a university. But if we're talking about the same pot and the way that pot would be allocated, it'd be hard to say that you couldn't achieve race diversity through those means.
I guess I would start by simply observing that we talk about mission as if it's monolithic and sort of simple. And I think on a college and university setting, the question of mission is complex and focused on many sets of issues. I'm with Catherine. I've got a closet full of broken crystal balls. I'm not about to predict what the court would do necessarily. But I would say this, that I think hearkening back to Justice O'Connor's very clear point in Grutter, an institution doesn't have to sacrifice its mission in the name of pursuing neutral alternatives. She said that quite clearly with regard to the notion that somehow the argument that Michigan at the time should sacrifice some notion of educational excellence in the name of diversity. This is both and, not either or, and that question of balance, I would hope, would be one that fundamentally is within the zone of the judgment of the institution, because as Scott noted, that limited but important deference that courts give is still around the question of mission, and I think that's got to be the starting point for the analysis.
I think that's a very important point. Justice Ginsburg's dissent said very explicitly that this new charge does not mean that academic selectivity has to be fall by the wayside in order to increase diversity under the framework. At the same time, that language was absent in Justice Kennedy's opinion. It appeared in the majority opinion in Grutter, notably absent. Even, the justices can respond to each other in their opinions, but it was something that I saw lacking. To give a stab at what the standard would look like, I think something like tolerable administrative expense, if that is going to mean anything as a term, I think it's going to charge universities when they do this cost-effective balance, effectiveness being what is sufficient diversity, the cost, obviously tolerable administrative expense, that when they do this analysis of some alternatives that are out there, race-neutral alternatives, looking at their, say, prototypical affirmative action program as it exists now, that has to have some kind of meaning. Whether it's 80% as expensive, or if the race-neutral is 120% as expensive, whatever that framework is very difficult to judge, of course, but it certainly does give a reasonable amount of room for a litigant bringing this case to argue that if it can be demonstrated that the numbers were close enough on an expense calculation, that's a viable claim under the framework that Fisher spelled out.
Okay, any questions from the audience? We have an inquisitive group here, I'm sure. Yes, Dick.
Scott, you put up a very interesting slide that you went over quickly. It showed Judge Higginbotham saying that he made a serious mistake, or his court made a serious mistake by not assuming that what Kennedy said in his Grutter dissent would become the rule of the court 10 years later. What does that mean? Why should he have assumed that what you said he should have?
So I think what he's saying is, in the interest of fairness, the university came to the case believing that it had to satisfy the Grutter majority opinion standard. And he's saying that UT was actually up against a different standard that hadn't been articulated yet, that he articulates in Fisher, Justice Kennedy does. So when Justice Kennedy and the Supreme Court kicked the case back to the Fifth Circuit, I think Judge Higginbotham is saying, I sort of feel for the university on just a simple fairness equation. They didn't know that this was going to be the standard. And the standard came from Justice Kennedy's dissenting opinion in Grutter, right? So it was out there, but it was the dissenting opinion. Now that's become the majority, the controlling opinion from Fisher. In my belief, I think that's why we're here today, because there has been a shift, and that was called out by Judge Higginbotham in a pure fairness argument.
He was being somewhat sarcastic, right?
Sure.
That he was,
right.
He didn't realize that he was supposed to apply the dissent, which normally you would never do. But he's underlining the idea that that things have changed. Yeah.
He seems tired when he's making the question. So.
Can I add just one other point of clarification here, too? This is not a point that Justice O'Connor in Grutter was crystal clear on. She was at best sort of murky on this sort of zone of deference. Justice Kennedy in dissent went one step further, and I think you'll see lots of folks in the room who have been leading and following guidance since then to basically say that's probably the right line. So operationally, lots of institutions have been following sort of that point of clarity, albeit from a dissent since then.
Okay, Mercedes is telling me we have time for one more question. Yes, Louis.
So Fisher's back in the district court. We have seen briefing there, but we don't yet have a decision. So the one key question that's back at the trial court stage, the court below, the Supreme Court, is this question of what critical mass means. And so we'll see which way the court goes. It's conceivable that it'll go back to the Supreme Court. It's not the most likely scenario. In 40 years, we've had not that many decisions come to the court on affirmative action, so it's more likely to get decided at the lower court level. But again, with the crystal balls, it's hard to know exactly where we go. And we don't have another case in line for another time for the court to say the same thing over and over again. So my expectation is that it'll be a little quiet for the time being. But I've been reading the newspaper about some efforts to bring another case and to get this back up to the Supreme Court. So who knows what will really come of that? But we're some years off before that happens, even if we do get back to the court on this topic.
Yeah, and I would just add there, the group that was behind the Fisher litigation is recruiting plaintiffs to sue Harvard, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the University of Wisconsin at Madison. So I think we'll have another opportunity, or there will be additional opportunities to test what the Supreme Court means in the Fisher case. So please join me in thanking our terrific panelists here.